For those who have been longtime viewers of my channel know that I am a huge fan of the Like a Dragon, or originally in North America, the Yakuza franchise. I started playing the original Yakuza on the PlayStation 2, the first one, with the English dub with Mark Hamill as Majima. And that was my first introduction to the series, like many others who actually had the opportunity to play the game. And I've played every North American release of the Yakuza games, so I will say that I am a pretty big fan of the franchise. I will dare say it's one of my favorite gaming franchises ever. So when it was announced that they would adapt at least the first storyline from the Yakuza franchise, or the Yakuza Kiwami storyline, into a TV show, I was actually pretty excited, mostly because of the source it was streaming from, and that is Amazon Prime. And one of the main reasons for my excitement, because of its association with Amazon Prime, was the release of the Fallout TV show that came out earlier this year. And that being one of my favorite shows of 2024 thus far. Because not only did it really depict the Fallout universe in a fitting manner, it also gave you a unique story that didn't insult the lore and the fans of the franchise. And that's what I hoped for the Yakuza, or should I say Like a Dragon Yakuza television show. For better and for worse, I got some of that. I wanted to wait until the full season was released on Amazon Prime. The first 3 episodes came out on October 24th, 2024, and the subsequent last 3 episodes came out on the 31st. So I wanted to watch all 6 episodes before I gave a review, and I'm actually glad I did, because there are a lot of aspects that happen in the second half of those 6 episodes that made me enjoy the series a lot better than the first 3 episodes. But there were still some major flaws that don't necessarily get me excited for the potential of a second season, because I will spoil this right now. I'm trying to keep the spoilers to a minimum just in case you do still want to watch this show. There is a cliffhanger that features the titular character Kazuma Kiryu and his father figure Kazuma. Now, there are some big differences when it comes to the television show and the video game narrative, because they actually decided to combine the timelines of Yakuza 0 and Yakuza Kiwami by having really a 2-half story separated by 10 years. In 1995, we see a young Kazuma Kiryu, we see a young Akira Nishikiyama, we see a young Yumi, and we see Nishikiyama's sister Miho. And we see them being the orphans that they are in the video game, also in the television show, but instead of it being in the early 1980s as it was in the video game in Yakuza 0 and before, it is set in 1995, which ironically enough is when the main narrative of Yakuza Kiwami, or Yakuza 1, begins with the death of Dojima, of the Dojima clan, at the hands apparently of Kazuma Kiryu. And in the television show we see that Kiryu, now in 2005, is being released from prison. We don't know exactly why. People who have played the video games know why, but people that don't know, who are just watching the TV show, have no idea exactly why Kiryu was put into prison between 1995 and 2005. And that isn't answered until literally the final episode. So to really get an idea of what Kiryu had to sacrifice, unlike in the video game, we don't know until the final episode. In turn, it actually does a great job of building not necessarily Kiryu's motivation and his character development, but Nishikiyama's, because this is easily the highlight of the show for me, is the way they portrayed Nishikiyama. We fully understand what his plight is. We understand beyond just him falling behind Kiryu is his necessity for urgency as the season progresses in the 1995 timeline. And by the end of the season, you understand exactly why he becomes the corrupt, power-hungry, and downright cold-blooded murderer that he is, because of the actions, or even inactions, of even Kiryu himself. That is one of the more positive aspects about the show, is the handling of Nishikiyama and his story. Even if the switching between the 1995 timeline and the 2005 timeline can get a little janky. And in reality, a lot of the show is rooted in the 1995 timeline more than the 2005 timeline, which is the complete opposite of what happened in the original games. On the opposite end, I will say that Kiryu as a character feels downright disappointing. And there's one major reason for that, but I will get to that in a few minutes. What I want to talk about first is the 1995 version of Kiryu. This Kiryu isn't just a young kid who got in over his head trying to idolize his father and become a member of the Yakuza. This one wants to actively become a member because he wants to become the Dragon of Dojima. He wants the power, the recognition, and the notoriety of being heralded as this top-tier Yakuza member who just so happens to be pretty good at fighting. And that's another plus I will say, even though I don't think they utilized the character too well, especially the 2005 version, they did give him a struggle. They did show that the young version of Kiryu wasn't invincible. He wasn't the tank and the fighting machine that he would become in the future, both physically and mentally. But the Kiryu that we're first introduced to, the young punk version of Kiryu, is not very endearing and doesn't feel like the person that he would become when it comes to the 2005 version. He's rather forward and blunt. He does have some quick one-liners at times, but he's still relatively stoic. But that was the case with him in Yakuza Kiwami or Yakuza 1. And one of the main things that really brought him out and kind of changed his character and softened his heart to a certain extent was the introduction of Haruka into his life. Now, we discover that Haruka is actually Yumi's daughter, who of course is the adoptive sister of Kiryu and Nishikiyama. In the TV show, however, Haruka is not Yumi's daughter. She's the daughter of an apparent blood sister that Yumi knew about, but they of course were split up as they were young. And Aiko, Haruka's mother in this version, is not too good of a person. So when Haruka is believed to be dead, blown up in an explosion, I won't spoil that part, and Aiko has no reason to believe that her daughter is alive, Kiryu happens to stumble across this and saves Haruka. Now, unlike the video game, Kiryu and Haruka's bond in the television show is pretty much rooted in that singular moment where he saves her instead of her getting blown up. And there's really no interaction between them for the rest of the series. And that, to me, was one of the biggest flaws when it comes to this television adaptation. Because anybody that has played these games, has played even the first game, has played Kiwami, knows how much Haruka means to Kiryu eventually. And it really shapes the person that he would become and forces him to look beyond his own self, his status as a member of the Yakuza, and help those who, like himself, were orphaned. Before we get to that character development of Kiryu, as we see in Yakuza 3, we see how protective he is of Haruka in Yakuza Kiwami and in Yakuza 1. We see also how much Haruka grows fond of him and sees him as not only as a protector, but as a father figure in the same way that Kazuma saw his own father figure. All of that is lost in this TV adaptation. Haruka doesn't really even have to exist in this TV adaptation other than that one scene where they reunite and then we discover that Yumi and Aiko aren't the same person. Unlike in the video game where we discover that, hey, her aunt is actually her mother, trying to protect her from getting harmed because of a situation that happens with a bunch of yen that has been stolen, which also happens in the television show, but it is not Yumi that steals the money. Now, there are also complaints about some of the other characters that were or weren't utilized too well, like, of course, Goro Majima, who has become one of the faces of the franchise as the years have progressed. But there must be a note that Majima as a character wasn't that influential or that big of a deal in the Kiwami story. He did have his moments, and one of those moments doesn't even occur in this version because the Colosseum doesn't exist in this television adaptation. Even though we do meet the florist, we also have Saejima, who essentially plays a doting sidekick to Majima for one scene. Date, who is such a big part of the Kiwami storyline, doesn't get much to do in this version, mostly because he doesn't interact with Kiryu as much as he does in the Kiwami storyline. In the 2005 version of Kiryu, there really isn't that much interaction between the two, which takes away some of the meaningful moments between Detective Date and Kiryu that last until most recently Infinite Wealth. Dojima also is a slimy individual, a conniving, cunning individual, the head of the Dojima family and the main manipulator behind Nishikiyama's decision in regards to his 1995 version. But it's unfortunate that one of the key reasons why eventually fans of the franchise and players of Yakuza Kiwami and Yakuza 1 discover why Nishikiyama hated him so much is actually removed from his character. Which is very odd because he seemed like the perfect person to do what Dojima in the video game tried to do. The voice actors and the actors themselves are done relatively well. I say the English dub is not as strong as you would have hoped it to be, but it's okay. The actors pretty much all fit their roles pretty well, even though that I feel the actor that plays Kiryu is a little bit too small and not as muscular as the video game counterpart, but he does give that air and atmosphere of his character pretty well in the 2005 version, whereas the 1995 version is more of a kid. He's more carefree and excitable and happy to be a part of the Yakuza because he feels like a big man. And I think he actually does a really good job of emphasizing just how three-dimensional Kiryu's personality could be when you look at his younger version, his younger self. But the stoic, hard-nosed Kiryu that we know post-jail is still there in presentation very well, but some of the aspects that make that Kiryu more likable don't exist, mostly because of the story and not because of the actor. Goro Majima's actor is fantastic in this, as is Nishikiyama's, who once again does a fantastic job of writing that line of sanity and insanity by the time the show wraps up. And even more so, seeing as a youth how dramatically different he presents himself compared to his 2005 counterpart. Yumi is alright, she gets a little bit more fire in her later in the series, whereas Aiko is one of the more annoying characters that you could find. She really doesn't have any redeemable qualities until the very end, and even then it feels like it's too little too late. And even some of the locales, as I mentioned, the Coliseum, don't exist in this TV adaptation. The Serena, the always chill bar that you could go back to and just relax and have moments of exposition dumped onto you at any given moment during the story, is only really shown once and has more of a tense feeling than the chill, laid-back atmosphere that it presents in the games. Kamurocho, on the opposite end, feels as bustling and robust and downright overwhelming, especially with the formation of the Millennium Tower, which is at the root of the power struggle that is going on between the Tojo clan and the Omi Alliance in this version of the story. From a cinematography aspect, the show looks absolutely gorgeous a majority of the time, though some of the underground fight scenes that have nothing to do with the Coliseum, which would have been fantastic if they did, look too muddied and dusty, which it makes sense why, but it does make it a little bit more difficult to see some of the more intricate fighting scenes, because the underground fights are where we see a majority of the fist-to-fist action when it comes to Kiryu, especially the young version. On the opposite end, the final battle, which I will not spoil for those who have never played the video game, is very underwhelming. It starts off good, but some of the key moments of any great Yakuza or Like a Dragon finale when it comes to the final battle don't exist here. The voice actors and the actors themselves are done relatively well. I say the English dub is not as strong as you would have hoped it to be, but it's okay. I know there are people that were also upset about the lack of humor and the side stories and stuff like that, with Miho, which is of course Nishikiyama's blood sister, bringing a lot of the comedic elements to the show. But Yakuza Kiwami and Yakuza 1, they weren't filled with a bunch of quirky characters and side stories that would become staples of the franchise going forward. That wasn't the case in the first game, so I'm not that upset about the lack of quote-unquote humor. But I will say I wish that the karaoke exclusive that is on YouTube was actually a part of the show, or even was utilized as a post-credit scene for the final episode. Overall, I will say that it is essentially a letdown. As a long-time fan of the Yakuza franchise, of the Like a Dragon franchise, even though that they said that the cast didn't play any of the games or even the producers and directors didn't go out of their way to try to understand fully what the source material provided. The biggest issue when it comes to this show, beyond just being a longtime fan of the franchise, is the fact that it doesn't really give you, as a viewer, both the incentive and the hope of a second season. It doesn't grab you and make you feel like you've just witnessed something actually special and will become excited about the idea of a second season. There are several plot holes and underwhelming characters and developments, and one of the main things, as I mentioned earlier, is the bond between Haruka and Kiryu that doesn't necessarily get explored here, but isn't really even formed here. If you're a fan of the franchise, I would suggest that you try to turn your brain off. Try to not do as badly as I am by comparing so many things to the game. Try to just enjoy it for what it is, but even with that, it's still not the most well-rounded or wholly enjoyable viewing experience as it could have been. And if you're a newer fan of the franchise, I will apologize to you, because this is not a good indication of what the game provides. And if you don't have any inclination of playing the Like a Dragon franchise games, be it the early version, the newer ones, Yakuza 0, it doesn't matter. If you don't have any incentive of playing the video games after, this won't give you any reason to say, hey, I actually want to give this a try. Or maybe even look on YouTube to get a synopsis of the entire storyline thus far. And even if you do, you'll be thoroughly confused as to why so many differences have been utilized to make this story, this prime story. It's not a bad show, but it's not as good as it could have been. If we had to give it a rating, pretty much a 5 out of 10. And I don't like to do ratings, but this feels like a 5 out of 10 show, when it could have been at least a 7, an 8. I would have hoped for a 9, but I would have settled for a 7. Just like I would have settled for Kiryu performing some kind of gigantic wrestling maneuver in the middle of the streets of Komorocho.